Okay, so in this tutorial we are going to learn how to apply a label onto an object, whether it has flat surfaces or curved surfaces, and a couple of ways that we can create geometry to match the surface geometry of an object. Now, there's a lighter weight way to do this in terms of if you were taking this to use as an asset in, say, Unity or Unreal or something where it's going to be part of a video game and needs to be rendered in real time. And that's through use of a material and UV editing and all of that. We're not going to go into that right now. What we're going to do is like the full, like heavy duty, like you want this label and you want it to actually have mass, essentially, like to be something that floats and maybe has a little bit of a shadowed edge on the other object, right? This is a much higher intensity task, in terms of geometry than if you were to do this all as a material. And so we're going to do it this way because it helps, it shows a couple ways to do this, and we haven't talked about UV editing at all yet, and that's a longer conversation. And so we're going to go ahead and do it this way, and then you get to learn a couple different deformers and a couple other neat tricks you can do in Cinema4D as well. So this is the end goal. And to start with, this is the image I began with. Now, this is not an advertisement or an endorsement for Crown Royal. In fact, in terms of whiskeys, Crown Royal is probably near the bottom of the list, right? Definitely not in my top 10 favorites. But it had a rounded label, right? It had something where it wasn't just a rectilinear shape. And so that's why I chose this label, is so that we can look at how to deal with transparency. So one of the things that I did in my process when I created this is I started in Illustrator, even though this was a PNG image I pulled off the internet. And so in what I did is I selected the image, and I went ahead and I did image trace on this, and I did silhouettes as the default, because what that's going to do is it's going to give me this boundary, right? It's just giving me this black boundary. And this is a super fast way to create a path that I can use to cut out the background, right? If I go and I use a vector path as the edges, even if I'm doing this in Photoshop, I get a much cleaner edge than if I go and try and use selection tools to do that, right? Because there's usually some feathering that happens on those edges. And so when you go and do one of the steps in Cinema4D, you get a lot of noise and pixelation at the edge of your image, and we don't want that. And so this helps get us a much cleaner edge. At least that's what I found. So I'm going to hit expand, and then I'm just going to select this path, and I'm going to copy it. And then I'm going to go ahead and go into Photoshop. And in Photoshop, I've already done these steps. But basically what I did was I went to the paths section, and I pasted this. And when I went to go to paste it, it asks you what way you want to paste it, and I wanted to paste it as a path. Right? I could paste it as a shape layer as well, but a path is what I wanted, right? So I created this vector mask, and then if we go over to my stuff here, right, I can create this vector mask on this image, and then and what that does is it basically creates right? It essentially eliminates, it makes the background transparent. The other thing that I did is you can tell that I also cropped this image, right? I cropped it just to barely outside the boundaries of the label, right? That just makes it a lot easier to work with when I bring it into Cinema4D. And then I just saved it as a PSD file. So I've done all that work already, and so you don't need to do that. I just wanted to kind of show you the process that I used to get to this point. So in the file, right, this is the end file, right, and it looks really complex, and we'll talk about some of what's going on here. But we're going to start with a much simpler file. And through the miracle of asynchronous tutorial editing, we now have the simpler scene that you will start with. right? In this scene, we currently have a couple lights, 3 lights in fact. We have a floor, a wine glass, and a cube. And we have a few materials down here as well. And I'm actually going to get rid of that material because we will make that in just a second. So one thing I want you to do to start with is all 3 of these lights make it take a fair amount of time to render. So we're definitely going to turn off light 2 for the time being. Let's go ahead and set our render settings a little bit different. So I'm going to go to render settings. I'm going to uncheck ambient occlusion. I'm going to turn on, I'm going to go to my physical, and I'm going to change this from adaptive to progressive. And then I'm going to go ahead and render this and just see how quick. Okay, great. That's working well. Okay, and you can see like where I have this light probably isn't great. And there's all the shadow and stuff, but it doesn't really matter. We're just going to leave it set the way it is now. Okay, so we've got this basic scene set up. And what we need to do is we need labels, right, on these objects. And so there are a couple things that need to happen. So first, we need something that we're going to put the label on. We've already talked about the image that we're going to use to create that material. And so we need an object that we're going to wrap around these other objects. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a plane. So I'm just going to go up here. I'm going to go to plane. And this plane is absolutely enormous, so we are going to make it significantly smaller. Something to note, I haven't talked about this yet, but any of these fields that have numeric values in them, you can actually do math in these fields. So if, say, I wanted this to be, let's say I want this to be, 4 centimeters instead of 400, I can just say divided by 100, and if I hit tab, it's going to make it 4, right? So divide it, and then with this, right, I'm just going to say 4, right? So sometimes like, oh, I want this to be half as big, but I don't want to do the math to do half as big. You can go ahead and do that. So 4 by 4 is actually probably a little too small. Let's go ahead and do, let's do 10 by 10. Okay, so we've got this, it's 10 by 10. I'm going to hide the cube for a second just in my window here. I'm also going to hide the floor for right now. So I'm going to turn that off as well, right? If I render this, they're both still going to be there, but they're just not visible in my editor, in my edit view, which makes my life a little bit easier. All right, so I've got this plane on the floor, and this is what I want to start wrapping around these other objects. So to make it stand out, I'm going to go ahead and I just have this matte plastic material from a previous tutorial. I'm going to turn luminance off so that it renders more quickly. And then I'm just going to go ahead and apply this to my plane, right? So this is like super bright blue, so I can see what's happening as I try and attach it to these different objects. And so to start with, we're going to start by trying to attach it to the bottle, right? And so with the bottle, right, this is it's an editable object, right? It's a cube. I'm going to select it. And what we're going to do is we're going to use something called Spline Wrap. And Spline Wrap is one of the deformers here. And what it allows you to do is take any object and wrap it along a spline, right? So, which makes sense based on the title of the object. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this plane and we're going to wrap it along. What we want is we want a spline that goes around the edges, the boundaries of this object. Now, in my case, when I modeled this edge here was not here. I ended up doing a loop cut to make that edge happen, right? So I just was in edges mode. I had my cube selected, right? And I still actually have that edge selected right now because That's the last thing I used. So this is the edge that I want to use. So if it's not selected, let me go ahead and deselect it. I'm going to change my layout to model, and I'm going to go to loop selection, and I'm going to hover over this, right? If I needed another edge, if I didn't have the edge that I wanted, I could do loop cut to select that edge, right? So I can go ahead and I could say, or to cut a new one. So I could hit the letter K on the keyboard and then hit the letter L to do a loop cut, right? And I can just hover over until I get this cut correct. Now, what if let's say I wanted to actually have the label go a different direction, right? But you'll notice that I'm trying to do this loop cut and it's not working, right? I'm only getting half of it, and I really want it to be looped all the way around the object. So I want to show you how to deal with that when you have geometry that isn't allowing you to do any loop cuts in the direction that you want to do them. So to do that, we're going to go to the front view, I think, or the side view. No, we'll do the right view. And then I'm going to hit the letter the letter S, and zoom out a little bit, right? And here's my bottle. And so now what I'm going to do is, again, I can't use loop cut because it's only doing half of this geometry. And so what I need to do is I need to do a different type of cut. So if I hit the letter K and I want to do a line cut, so I hit the letter K again, then what I can do is I can just basically draw a straight line down through this geometry, but I need to make sure under the options that I uncheck visible only, right? And then I can also check mark this select cuts options, which will allow me to select the cuts once they're made, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click, and I'm going to hold down Shift so that I get a straight edge. And you'll see where those dots are every intersection that it goes through. And then once I get there, now I could go through and continue this cut, but I can also just hit escape at this point, and it will have created that cut. Now when I go back to my perspective view, right, you'll see that it actually did, right, because this has thickness, it cut around the outside and around the inside of the object, right? But it has allowed me to make that cut that then I could select with my loop selection tool and use. Now, I don't need those cuts, so I'm going to undo this. That's just a little helpful hint, right? So I have this ring selected, this edge selected, and now what I need to do is I need to turn this edge into a spline. And so I don't accidentally cut anything, I'm going to go back to the Move tool, which is probably one of the safer tools around. Right? I could use this, right, as a moment to like really mess with the geometry of my object, but I'm not going to do that. So I have this selected. I'm going to go up to, I can either go to Mesh or to Spline at the top of the screen, those menus. And in either case, I'm going to go down to Conversion, right? And Conversion, and I'm going to go Edge to Spline either through Mesh, or I can go to Spline, Conversion, Edge to Spline, right? The same tool is in two places. So if I click this, what happens is if you look over here in my object hierarchy, I now have a child object called cube.spline, right? And so that is that edge turned into a spline. This is really powerful, right? Because you could take any edge on a really complex object and turn it into a spline and then be able to align things on that. And there's a lot of other work you can do using a spline. So I'm going to go ahead and in this case, I'm going to do spline wrap. Now, for spline wrap to work, right, like all deformers, the spline wrap needs to be a child of the object you want to deform. So I'm going to make spline wrap a child of the plane. And then with spline wrap selected, I now need to choose a spline to use as this object will be wrapped around. And so I'm going to go ahead and I click on this little gray arrow over here until it turns white. I come up and I can click on cube.spline, right? And it should automatically make a pretty immediate change to that object, right? And so the other way that, I'm going to undo that though, because the other way I can populate this field is a little trickier. You click drag. You can't just click and then drag, because if you click and then drag, then you select this. But once I've clicked drag, if I just click drag quickly, I can drop this in here as well, right? That's the other option I've got. And then note that once I have a spline here, there's this little drop down arrow, which allows me to actually access all of the settings for this spline from within the spline wrap deformer, right? So I can change the type from linear, I can change the intermediate points from adaptive to either uniform or natural, or right, leave it as it is. In this case, I'm going to just say, let's just say, I don't know which one would be better. We'll do adaptive. That seems like, these are hard corners. It seems like it'll probably do best. But notice that when I make that change, the object changes a little bit too. So there might be something to setting this to uniform. We'll see how it goes. Actually, no, let's do natural. Let's try that. Who knows? Okay, so obviously this plane is not wrapping the way that we want it to, right? And so we need to make a change there. And there's a couple places we could attempt to make that change. First, we could say, oh, well, maybe it's not x plus. Maybe I want y plus. No, that's not going to do it for me. Maybe I want z plus. Nope, that's not going to do it for me. So I'm going to leave this at x plus for now. I'm going to go to my plane here, and I'm going to change my orientation to x plus. And then z plus. There we go, right? So I've changed my orientation to z plus. And now you're going to notice that this isn't exactly where we want it to be, right? It's actually inside the bottle, and things are very odd, right? It's not aligning, right? The corners of this spline, oh boy, hold on a second. The corners of this spline are, right, not where these objects are. And that's because this plane doesn't have enough subdivisions, right? So let's go ahead and change our plane from having 10 width segments and 10 height segments to, let's just do 20 to start with. Right, so 20, if I rotate now and look down from above, it's getting it closer, right, but it's still not quite right. And so I think at this point it might be the spline settings that are giving me problems. Right, so let's go back to adaptive, see what happens. Let's go back to uniform. Right, and so even still, something isn't quite right with this, right? And so I think that I still need either more subdivisions or I need to adjust some other size settings. Now, one of the things that's going on here, right, these subdivisions should be square, but you'll notice that those subdivisions are really rectilinear right now. And that's because this is being stretched from the beginning of the spline all the way around. So it's actually taking that, that plane and it is stretching it like a piece of rubber around the object. And so let's look at some of the spline wrap settings. So I'm going to close up the spline settings so we don't get confused, right? So I click that arrow back up. So there's this rail. We'll talk about that in a second. There's the axis, right? X plus, X minus, which you saw didn't, right? Y plus doesn't seem to work very well. Z plus, the plane is going to basically be in the middle, right? X plus is obviously what we want. Strength is how closely attached to this spline it is. And so if I pull this off, you'll see that it eventually goes back to where it was set before, right? And so now it's, and you can watch how that stretches and deforms as I change this, right? And you can also see this, that point back there is the start and the end point of this spline. So the setting that's controlling this is this mode where it says fit spline, right? Do we want it to stretch along the entire length of the spline, or do we want to keep the length, right? In our case, we want to keep the length, right? And so now this is actually the size that it should be. And if I adjust the strength now, you'll see it basically just flips and rotates up. Now, how do I get it to appear somewhere else on the spline? To do that, there's a couple options here. First, there's offset. Offset is what allows it to go all the way around the object from the start to the starting point to the ending point, right? So wherever I want this label to be, this is how I start to get that. Now I'm going to put it on the corner for the time being just because I want to rotate my view and I want to double check and make sure that this looks like, yeah, it looks like it's pretty close. You can see that it's actually inside the glass a little bit here, and we'll talk about ways that we can fix that, right? We could either we could make our plane a little bit different. There's other ways we could create this object so that it has similar number of sides as the current object, but we're going to do it this way, and because it's a little bit easier. Okay. So the offset, right, I probably want this to be centered, right, on one of these, right, somewhere in the center of this face. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust my offset to 50%. 50% seems to be pretty well centered, which is nice. That means that the starting and ending point is on the other side of the object. I am going to render this really quick just to make sure. Yeah. Right. So you'll see that my object is intersecting with the glass. And so, right, it's a little bit too close, and we'll adjust that in just a second. But it is on the lit side. Okay. So now if we want to adjust the scale of this object on here, there's a couple things we can do. First, this from and to, where it says 0 to 100%. If I adjust these settings, right, I can shrink the size of this object, right? In our case, we don't want to be able to shrink it. We actually want this to be a little bit larger on the surface of this object. And so what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to adjust the scale of the plane, right? The plane is 10 by 10. Let's go ahead and make that 15 by 15. Right? And once I make it 15 by 15, that's a pretty good size. That's about, how big I want it to be. But again, now it's a little offset. So I'm going to go to Spline Wrap, and I'm going to adjust my offset to, it looks like somewhere around 46 or 45.5% is probably just about where I want it to be. Maybe 46% was actually better. Yeah, that's about right. I could go to a different view to make that determination as well, but I'm not going to go ahead and do that right now. There's something else I want you to note. You'll notice that this surface is black and this surface is blue. Right? That's giving us a hint that something is backwards right now. Right? And so let's go ahead and try and flip this around to see if we can set it so that it's actually facing the right direction. And so the first thing I'm going to do is my orientation is Z plus. I'm going to go ahead and see what happens if I make that Z minus. Nothing. I'm going to go see what happens if I make it X minus or X plus. It disappears. Y plus, right? It actually is sort of halfway right, but it's facing up. And so once I set this to Y plus, let's go ahead and see what happens if I change the orientation here. So let's go Y plus on this too. Nope. Let's go Z plus. Let's go Z minus. Let's go X minus. So you'll notice that none of these are making any difference, right? So I'm going to go back to having this as Z plus, right? And this is backwards. And we're going to talk about some of the issues that are going to come up when we work with this in just a little bit and how to fix that this is backwards, right? We've tried to do things that would make sense, and they have not worked. Okay, so we've got keep length. We've got our size of our plane set. Oh, and I somehow accidentally set my width segments to 3. Let's go ahead and set that to 20. Okay. So I've got this set. So now I need to I need to create a material and apply it to this. And then we're going to see some of the other issues that are coming out. So I'm going to go to my layouts. I'm going to go back to standard. And I'm going to double click to create a new material. I'm going to double click on that material to bring up the material editor. And what I want to do is I want that label that I've got to be the color texture. And so I'm going to go ahead and go down here. I'm going to go to load image. And I'm going to go to my crownlabel.psd file. I'm going to open that up. And now I've got this crown label on here. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this onto the plane. And I'm going to make sure I put it on the plane in the object manager so that I can see it. And you'll notice that, again, my label is both upside down and inside out, which is a little problematic. In order to edit this material, What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate my plane and delete the spline warp off of one of them and then move that plane just to make it a little easier to see what's going on before we get any further with this. So I'm going to go ahead and copy my plane and paste it. I'm going to delete the spline warp off this copied version. I'm going to select my plane. I'm going to hit the letter E, and I'm just going to drag this thing over. Right, and you'll see that this plane is, with the orientation I currently have it set at, right, things are upside down, and there's some other issues here. But let's go ahead and let's render this and just see what it looks like here. There's a lot of light hitting that object, and it's halfway through the floor, so I'm going to pull this up. And I'm also just going to rotate this one flat because of all the light that's hitting it when it's aimed directly at the light. There we go. This is much better. Right, and so if I rotate this, you'll see that this is backwards. And if I undo that rotation, let's go ahead and change the orientation of this, right? So it's at Z plus right now. Let's just go to Y plus. There we go. Right, so we've at least got this facing up. Right, so I render this, and you'll notice that I have this white boundary around the outside of this plane. You also notice that essentially the image has been, it's probably been stretched a little bit to be the square dimensions of this. I cropped it to somewhat close to square, but it's not perfect. So that's just something to note. There's probably a little distortion in here, but I'm not worried about that right now because I'm really just trying to show this technique. So now what we need is this white boundary to go, right? You know that the image I created has transparency, but for some reason we're not seeing it here. And so what we need to do is double click on our material, and we need to go to the alpha channel here. We need to turn the alpha channel on, and alpha again is transparency. If I turn the alpha channel on and render this again, right, I still have this boundary. And so what I need to do is I need to come in here and I need to go to load image, and I need to load this image again. Right, so I'm going to select the same image. I'm going to hit open. Now, as soon as I do that, you'll notice that something changes here. And it's actually a hint as to like one of the ways you can apply a label as a material in Cinema4D with another material under it. So what are we seeing here, right? We're seeing this blue material show up behind our label. And if we look at our plane, the plane still has that blue plastic material on it, and it has this other material, right? So we're actually getting the overlay of these two materials, which is pretty cool. But in this case, I don't want that, right? I want to delete the tag for the matte blue plastic, right? So if I delete that tag, I'm going to go ahead and delete this off the one that we have in our model as well. And I go ahead to render this, right? Now I have this image that has smooth edges, even though I didn't have to model any of that, right? And something to note, if this is really, really large, any sort of, you can see it here as I zoom in, right? This like haziness here, this is that feathering I'm talking about, where it goes from opaque to transparent. And if I'm really close to it, in this case, it doesn't look bad. You can see a little bit of noise here. And this is, by the way, this is like a really low quality image, right? It's low resolution. You can see my resolution here in my material editor is 414 by 542 pixels. That's tiny. Usually when you're using images, the higher the resolution, the better. 4096 by 4096 pixels is going to give you an incredibly high resolution. But the other thing to note is like, how close is someone going to be to this? And if they're not going to be very close to it, then you can probably get away with a little bit more pixelated image. The other thing to note is that this image is also like, it's a PNG that was super compressed. And so there's going to be artifacts on here that, it actually has a pretty, because PNG does a good job with its compression, you don't really notice it here. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this image to give some bump information as well. And when we do that, that is going to show, it's actually going to, the noise in the image from all the artifacting from compression is going to give us texture. which is great, right? It's actually, it's a mistake. It's something that you usually wouldn't want, but in our case, it's actually going to do something nice. So, right, Crown Royal labels are embossed, and so we want to be able to emboss this label. And we could do a better job. We could make this grayscale, and we could figure out, okay, what are the parts that are that pop out, what parts go in, and we could make adjustments to that. But we're doing this the cheap and dirty way, just to show that it's possible. So we're going to go to our bump channel. We're going to turn that on. We're going to use the image again, and instead of going to load image, we can also go to bitmaps. And so anything that, any image file that we've already used somewhere else will show up in our scene, will show up here. So I'm just going to go ahead and click that. And as soon as I do that, you'll see that it's embossing it, right? Wherever there's dark areas, it's going to push into the surface. And wherever there's brighter areas, it's going to be pulling out. And so if I render this, you can kind of start to see some of that embossing taking place. Now, I'm going to go ahead and rotate the view a little bit so that we get a better edge. And then something else I'm going to do is I'm going to go to reflectance, and I'm going to go ahead and add a reflectance layer, and I'm going to reduce that right down somewhat. It's still going to be like way shinier than we need it, but I just want that so that we can really see some of those highlights on here. Right, and so you're going to notice, maybe if I get in a little closer, right, and you can kind of see it in this preview, but the text is being pressed back into the label rather than standing out on top of the label. And so what we need to do is we need to adjust our bump settings a little bit so that we can actually have this embossing happen in the opposite direction. And honestly, it's a little bit weak. We want it to be stronger. So I'm going to go ahead and click bump. And so instead of 20%, I'm going to say negative 53%, right? And you can see in this preview now, right, if I went to 50% here, the R and stuff is pushed in. And if I go to, 53 or, I don't want to go too crazy, but let's just do somewhere around 60%, right? And now when I render this, first you're going to notice that you see all sorts of wobbling and things on the surface. That's those compression artifacts. You'll actually see that there's some hard corners in here, and that's because of the way it kind of breaks up in any even areas of color and compresses them. But it's also going to push out the text on all of these objects. And it actually looks like it's so shiny, it looks like it's like it's wet. So let's go ahead and go to our reflectance. And right, I've reduced that, but let's increase our roughness some so it's a little bit less intense. I'm going to reduce the reflection strength some as well. This is something, you can do. If this was a paper label, right, we would probably want to make it really diffuse, right? And so we would increase our specular strength and increase our roughness and just totally take our reflection strength down. But let's go ahead and just see what this looks like if we render it pretty quick. That's better. We still get some really nice highlights on here, but the surface is much smoother. Even in this like coarse preview, it looks pretty good. Right? And so you can see that if, right, the image doesn't look fantastic when we're this close to it, but remember, this is going to be much smaller, and we're not going to be that close to this label in this example. But you can see here's all that artifacting that's happening around this text, right? So it looks kind of ugly in there, and that's why you want to use higher resolution images. But we're just going to pretend that we put some noise on this as well to make it look more real. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and zoom out on that. Right, so all of those settings, because I'm doing that on the material, they're also being applied to the material over here. And so you will see now, right, this is upside down and inside out. And so we need to fix that. And also this material is currently partly, stuck into the glass, or it's right at the surface of the glass. And so there's going to be some weird artifacting and things that happen there. So let's make those changes. So first, what we're going to do to pull this out a little ways from our glass is we're going to select our cube spline, and we're actually just going to make the cube spline a little tiny bit bigger. We're going to set it, instead of the scale being set to 1, the scale will be set to 1.01. And we'll do that in all 3 directions just to be uniform about it. Right? And so you'll also notice that when I did that, it actually expands the size of the label just a hair too. Okay, so I've expanded this a bit, which should bring it so that it's no longer in the surface of the glass, but it should be just out in front of the glass. Now you'll also notice that because of the way I tend to use the computer, this is actually rotated now. It's like way off over here. And that's because I accidentally, like when I tab through these, and then when I tab the next time I hit the letter 3 to rotate, it ends up setting that as a value. So I'm going to go ahead and reset that back to 0, and it should be reset. But now I just need to make sure that I'm not going to set some other rotation to 3 degrees, right? Okay, so this is probably a little bit better. We might need to increase that scale a touch more, but it's just a hair outside the object, which is also going to create a little bit of a shadow around the edge, which is something that we would want, right? Because paper labels will have a tiny bit of shadow against the glass because they do stand out off the glass just a touch. Okay, so now we need to flip this over. So the way we're going to flip this over is by creating a rail. Right, so if you look at the spline wrap, right, there's this, oops, yeah, and go to the Object tab. There's this option for our spline, and then there's this option for our rail. The rail is a second spline that allows us to both control the orientation of this, but it also allows us to control, like if this was on an object where the face is at an angle, it's not just straight up and down, we could have that second spline be wider, and so it would also help us with the angle of the object. And so what we're going to do is we're actually, in this case, because this is straight up and down, we're just going to copy our cube spline. So I'm going to copy it, I'm going to paste it, and then I'm going to double click on that name and rename it rail. And then I'm going to pull this down and make it a child of the cube as well, right? So it's all in one place and they move together when I move the cube. And now I'm going to go to my spline wrap on the plane, and I'm going to go ahead and click on this arrow, and I'm going to click on the rail. Now, as soon as I do that, it gets a little bit crazy, right? And that's because the rail and the cube spline are directly on top of one another. And that is problematic, right? You can see that it's at an angle, all sorts of madness is going on. So let's select our rail, and let's go back to make sure we're in object mode, and then hit the letter E so we have the move tool. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull this up. Now, as soon as I do that, it flips one direction or the other, right? So now this is at least correct in this way, but it's upside down. So how are we going to fix the fact that this is upside down? Let's go ahead and render this even with it upside down and see what we get. Okay. All right, so it looks like this is not set in the glass anymore, which is a really good thing. However, this object is completely upside down. Okay, so it's upside down. So what we need to do is we need to fix that orientation, and there's a couple places we're going to need to fix that. So first we're going to need to select our plane, and we're going to need to change the orientation from Z plus to Z minus. That will flip it upside down, and this is basically trial and error, right? You just need to figure out which planes based on how you've modeled and what side you're going on. You just keep flipping until you figure it out. There's not really a simple way to do it for every single case. And then what we need to do is switch this to X minus, right? Under spline wrap, right? It should be X minus. And if we do that, then it should be at the correct orientation. And again, that was just trial and error. I took a few moments just to flip things around and see what happened. Right, and so now I'm getting this preview going, and we can just, and now we're going, I'm just going to let this run for just a little bit. while we get this set. All right, so you can start to see some of the embossing having an effect on here, and this label appears as though it is attached to the glass surface, right, with a little bit of a shadow behind it. If we turned on ambient occlusion, that shadowing would be a little bit stronger. And yeah, but yeah, so here we go, right? We've got our Crown Royal label attached to this surface. Now, something we should try as well is expanding the dimensions of this label so that it hangs off the edge, or we can just rotate it, because I want to show you how it matches on the corners. So let's go ahead and with our spline wrap selected, let's adjust our offset. All right, so I'm going to adjust the offset, and I'm just going to bring this over so that it's around this corner. And then we can go ahead and render this again and see what we get. Now, what would be nice is if we adjusted our subdivisions, you know, because we know that this is the corner that we want, we could probably adjust the size on the plane of our subdivisions, like by number. So I could, if I decrease this a little bit, you'll see I'm going to get a much harder edge here because now it is in the right spot. If I decrease this a few more times, I might be able to get this to be in a place where it would align nicely. But let's go ahead and do the spline wrap and see if we adjust our offset a hair, if we get something a little bit closer. It's closer. Let's go down. Let's do one fewer subdivisions on our plane. Say 13. And let's do 12 actually. Okay, now that I've done 12, let's go ahead to our spline wrap and adjust our offset again. This is getting really close. It's not perfect, but it is getting much closer in terms of, right, how this fits. And the reason we want to make sure that it's close is because if it's not, then when we render this, we're going to get some weird edge things happening here, right? Either it's going to be too rounded or it's not going to bend correctly, right? But with this, we get these nice crisp edges, much like the glass bottle underneath it has, right? That's really what we're going for, is trying to make sure that it looks like it's accurately wrapped around that. And if we go with too many subdivisions, then we're going to have some issues where it doesn't wrap around these edges hard, right? And again, it depends on how close we are. With this, these aren't quite perfect, but if, you know, if this is just something that's, you know, sort of in the background or middle ground, and I'm rendering it, it's close enough right now that I'm not going to notice that it's not quite right, right? Although it looks really weird off set at an angle like that. Okay, so let's look. So that is this part of the tutorial, right? You could rearrange this. You could make this label a little bigger so it falls over the edges there. But right, this allows us to, you know, start with this process and use that spline as a way that we can wrap an object around. Okay. So let's go ahead and in the next tutorial, we're going to continue to look at spline wrap, or to continue to look at taking an edge and making it a spline, but we're going to also look at the cloner and how we can add detail and add objects to the surface of another object using the cloner and the spline wrap tool. Using the cloner and the edge to spline option. Now, and then after that, we're going to look at the surface deformer, and we're going to use the surface deformer to apply another label to the side of this cup, right? Where even if I had two splines on this, because of the curvature, it would really, the label would not lay flat against the surface of this object. And we really need the surface deformer in order to make that happen. Okay.